What is the true story of the Sphinx? Welcome to Collapse, where history comes alive, and every video immerses you in the destinies of those who shaped the world. Today, let's trace the paths of a stone mystery that has defied time for nearly 5 millennia, the Sphinx of Giza. Silent guardian of the desert, it watches impassively over the pyramids, like the shadow of a forgotten secret. A colossal monument, it embodies both the power of the pharaohs and the enigma of eternal Egypt. But behind this face, worn by sand and wind, one question remains. Who really sculpted the Sphinx? Was it the work of a single king, a symbol of his glory and immortal reign? Or perhaps an even older legacy, a vestige of a vanished civilization whose history has faded into the mists of time? But before embarking on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Thank you, and have a good journey. At the end of the last glacial period, major climatic transformations occurred on the planet, creating new environments. Human populations, until then centered on hunting, gathering, and fishing, gradually saw their territories change. Between 10,000 and 2,000. Before Christ, profound changes appeared in social organization, resource exploitation, and the establishment of more stable communities. Landscapes warmed, forests expanded in many regions, while some areas, once arid, partially turned green. Nomadic groups settled permanently near water points and areas rich in vegetation, pioneers of future villages. An intensification of the exchange of knowledge and tools was observed. Many populations improved their stone cutting and polishing techniques, thus developing objects better suited to new living conditions. This period is crucial because it lays the foundations for the transition from a predation economy to the first forms of agriculture and livestock, and preludes to the birth of true civilizations. At the heart of the Holocene warming process, the Sahara experienced a unique climatic episode, often called the African humid period. Between approximately 8500 and 5500 before Christ, rainfall increased significantly, allowing the emergence of lakes, temporary rivers, and marshy areas in previously desert spaces. This transformation favored the presence of abundant fauna. Antelopes, buffaloes, giraffes, and other herbivores moved in ecological corridors connecting north to south. Human groups took advantage of this temporary greening to hunt, fish, and gather wild plants along the shores. Seasonal camps were organized, sometimes for several consecutive years, while artistic traditions, such as the rock paintings of Tessili Niger in Algeria, bore witness to the daily life and beliefs of these populations. However, this bountiful period was relatively short-lived. As the climate gradually warmed, humidity decreased in the Saharan zone, compelling communities to move to more hospitable regions, such as the Nile Valley or the Sahel. These movements fueled the first transfers of technologies and cultural practices, contributing to the spread of skills related to nascent agriculture and livestock in the riverine areas of the Great Sand Sea. The Neolithization, or the adoption of agriculture and animal husbandry, does not occur at a single point on the globe, but in multiple simultaneous or successive centers. Among these key regions, the Near East plays a decisive role. In the Levant area, which includes Palestine, Israel, Jordan, and southern Lebanon, the first evidence of agriculture appears around the 9th millennium before Christi. Communities cultivate wild cereals, such as barley and wheat, while goat and sheep herding becomes increasingly significant. In Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the development of irrigation promotes sedentarization and the emergence of more structured villages. Subsequently, this knowledge spreads to Anatolia, and then gradually reaches Europe and the Nile Valley. Meanwhile, cattle domestication provides milk, traction power, and meat, stimulating both productivity and the complexity of lifestyles. Thus, in various territories, human groups exploit new resources and ensure a more stable control of their subsistence, paving the way for more complex forms of social organization. In this context of agricultural expansion and sedentarization, the birth of the first monumental architectures illustrates the community's desire to durably mark the landscape. An early example is Göbekli Tepe, located in present-day southeastern Turkey, where monumental stone sanctuaries dated to the 10th millennium before Christ demonstrate a complex social organization centered around collective rituals rather than mere survival. Along the Atlantic coasts of Western Europe, people erect vast alignments of megaliths and build dolmens or menhirs, often considered sacred or funerary sites. In several regions of Central Europe, interrupted ditch enclosures appear, revealing a new way of delineating space and gathering populations around ceremonial sites. These imposing constructions require significant collective labor, advanced planning, and increased logistical mastery. The first builders thus leave tangible testimonies of an emerging culture of monumentality and a desire to connect to forces believed to govern the cosmos or oversee the cycle of the seasons. Between 5,000 and 3,000 before Christ, the first signs of proto-urbanization are observed in several world regions. In the Tigris and Euphrates basin, small agglomerations like Uruk rapidly develop into genuine political and religious centers. Along the Nile Valley, fortified villages appear, foreshadowing the emergence of centralized power. On the Indian subcontinent, the Indus Valley witnesses the birth of proto-urban sites, where urban planning and craft specialization are already organized. Further east, along the Yellow River, communities settle around rice cultivation and develop a rudimentary proto-bureaucracy. In these centers, the accumulation of agricultural surpluses enables the rise of elites, distinguished by the control of resources and the encouragement of technical progress. Craftsmanship diversifies with the production of pottery, textiles, metal tools, and jewelry, while hierarchies establish between chiefs, priests, and administrators. These nascent urban nuclei contribute to the lasting structuring of collective life, laying the foundations for increasingly marked systems of governance and social stratification. Parallel to these socio-economic developments, sky observation takes on growing importance. Agricultural societies need markers to organize their sowing and harvesting, as well as to anticipate river floods or drought periods. It is in this context that the first calendars appear, often combining solar and lunar cycles. Equinoxes and solstices become key moments, offering milestones to plan agricultural activities. Many Neolithic monuments, such as some megaliths in Europe or proto-urban temples in the Near East, may have served as astronomical markers. For example, the precise alignment of certain structures with the sun's path at sunrise or sunset indicates a keen awareness of celestial phenomena. These observations, based on the experience and repetition of seasonal events, lay the foundation for what might be called a necessity astronomy. By linking the agricultural cycle to cosmic phenomena, populations anchor their beliefs in a broader natural order. Subsequently, these astrological or astronomical knowledge will evolve into a more elaborate corpus of knowledge, but at the Neolithic era, they primarily meet practical survival needs. Finally, the emergence of long-distance exchange networks amplifies the circulation of objects, ideas, and technologies. From the highlands of Anatolia and the Caucasus, obsidian, a sharp volcanic rock, is exported to Mesopotamia and the Levant, used to make high-quality cutting tools. Copper, extracted in different regions, begins to be used for the manufacture of weapons and utensils, foreshadowing the age of metals. Simultaneously, Baltic amber travels to Central and Southern Europe, while marine shells serve as ornaments or currency in communities far from any sea access. The routes often follow rivers, coastal paths, or identified land corridors. Beyond material goods, these networks promote the diffusion of artistic styles, religious practices, and technical know-how, such as weaving or pottery methods. Extended exchanges trigger the appearance of embryonic diplomatic contacts and merchant hierarchies among groups controlling the passage points. Thus, interdependence links are established, contributing to the emergence of more complex societies and foreshadowing future trade routes of antiquity. Before the construction of the gigantic monuments of Giza, Egypt relies on a set of territories whose unity is strongly linked to the Nile, a river that springs from distant regions in Central Africa and runs thousands of kilometers before reaching the Mediterranean. In this mostly desert environment, life depends almost exclusively on the regularity of the annual floods. Every year, the river overflows its banks, flooding the surrounding plains and depositing a fertile layer of silt, a sediment enriching the soils. This dynamic makes intensive agriculture possible, provided suitable irrigation systems are developed. Over the centuries, local populations have concentrated on the riverbanks, forming villages and towns that will eventually unite into two large geographical entities, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the delta. It is in this very particular geographical context that the pharaonic state will emerge. Around 3100 before Christ, political changes lead to the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under the authority of a single ruler, identified by the Egyptian tradition as King Narmer. Often considered the first pharaoh, Narmer would have conducted military campaigns to connect these two entities, sealing his triumph with symbolic ceremonies highlighting the founding act of the Egyptian state. This union grants the new kingdom greater cohesion, stimulated by the establishment of an administration capable of collecting taxes and managing resources throughout the territory. The development of hieroglyphic writing is then part of a centralization logic. It allows official acts to be recorded, offerings to be documented, and royal decrees to be disseminated. The first written documents testify to the predominant role of the king, which asserts itself not only as a military leader, but also as the guarantor of divine harmony. The Egyptian royal ideology is built around the notion of Ma'at, a concept encompassing universal order, justice, and cosmic balance. The king, son of the sun god Re, presents himself as the guarantor of Ma'at on earth. This vision gives birth to a whole set of rituals, processions, and Seder festivals, ceremonies intended to symbolically renew the pharaoh's strength so that he can continue to rule effectively. In the temples erected in his honor, the monarch celebrates the power of the gods and ensures that the rites are performed correctly. The offerings and hymns pronounced there consolidate the link between the divine sphere and the world of men. Thus, the political structure is not limited to a simple administrative apparatus. It is also anchored in a complex spirituality, where the sovereign occupies a central place, both secular and sacred. To build palaces, temples, and tombs, ancient Egypt relied on various materials extracted from quarries located along the Nile. Limestone, found in the regions of Tura and Mokattam near Cairo, provides white and rather soft blocks, suitable for smooth facings and ornaments. Further south at Aswan, the pink granite quarries deliver a much harder stone, prized for sculpting statues and obelisks, as well as for reinforcing certain architectural elements. Gabbro and other rarer rocks were also used, often for specific or decorative purposes. The river becomes the major logistical axis for transporting these blocks. Once extracted, they are loaded onto boats and transported to the construction sites, where they are carved with copper and stone tools. This rigorous organization foreshadows the great building tradition that would culminate with the imposing monuments of the Old Kingdom. Before the appearance of smooth-sided pyramids, royal tombs were in the form of mastabas, low rectangular structures with sloping walls. They developed mainly during the first dynasties to house the sovereign's remains and ensure him an eternal home. Then, under the reign of King Djoser, around 2700 before Christ, the architect and sage Imhotep designed the first step pyramid at Saqqara, thus elevating the mastaba form to new heights. This step marked a major advance in funerary monumentality, illustrating the pharaoh's desire to stand out with large-scale projects. Djoser's successors gradually perfected the technique, improving the precision of alignments and the quality of the finishes. Over time, the edifice took on a more regular form, eventually leading to the smooth pyramids of the Fourth Dynasty, those of Sneferu, and then the great kings Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. The Giza Plateau, located on the west bank of the Nile, presents itself as an elevated chalky promontory overlooking the valley. This geographical position, near a branch of the river and a port, offers numerous advantages for establishing a royal funerary complex. Construction materials can easily be transported by river, then stored at the foot of the plateau before being hoisted to the top. Moreover, the solid rock foundation provides a stable base for the immense monuments envisioned. The architects of the Fourth Dynasty quickly recognized the strategic potential of this site. The clear view allows the pyramids to be placed at the heart of a cosmic staging, connected to the path of the sun and the cycle of the pharaoh's rebirth in the afterlife. This natural and spiritual configuration creates the ideal conditions for establishing a colossal funerary center. Khufu, or Cheops, likely reigned between 2589 and 2566 before Christi, and his name is forever associated with the Great Pyramid, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Erected on the Giza Plateau, this monumental structure originally rose to about 146 meters in height, made up of several million blocks, some weighing more than 2 tons. The project includes a valley temple, connected to the pyramid by a covered causeway where offerings and ritual objects were transported. This path, often adorned with reliefs and paintings, symbolized the progression of the deceased king towards his solar transfiguration. Each element is planned on an unprecedented scale. The burial chamber, located at the heart of the monument, housed the royal sarcophagus, sealed behind granite slabs transported from Aswan. The architects had to precisely calculate the alignment and pressure exerted by the upper blocks to prevent any collapse. Many debates persist regarding the construction techniques. Straight or helical ramps, wooden sleds are mentioned. Whatever the method, the construction site reflects the mobilization of a workforce directed by the administrative elite. Khufu capitalizes on the agricultural surpluses generated by the annual Nile flood to feed and house these workers, thus demonstrating the centralization capacity of pharaonic power. This organization, both religious, economic, and technical, consolidates the prestige of the king, whose cult is perpetuated through his funeral complex. Khafre, or Khafre, likely reigned from 2558 to 2532 before Christi and erected the second largest pyramid at Giza. Slightly lower than Khufu's, it appears more imposing due to its position on higher ground. Like his predecessor, Khafre ordered the construction of a valley temple located near a possible dock, connected to the pyramid by a monumental causeway. This structure embodies the coherence of a solar program, centering the king's worship on Re, the supreme solar deity. Khafre's complex is distinguished by the presence of the Sphinx, a colossal guardian with the body of a lion and the face of the ruler. Carved directly into a rocky promontory, it symbolizes protective vigor and royal reason. The adjoining temples, built with large limestone and pink granite blocks, carry forward the monumental aesthetics initiated under Khufu, but accentuate the sanctity of the path. The Valley Temple, for instance, might have hosted purification ceremonies before the royal body was transported to the upper temple near the pyramid. Khafre thus asserts himself as the continuer of solar worship, reinforcing pharaonic authority in an already highly centralized state. His funerary complex, perfectly aligned, fits into the topography of Giza, echoing the cosmic conceptions of the time, where earth and sky converge around the sacred figure of the king. His face, topped with the nemes, underscores the divine union. Mycerinus, or Menkaure, reigned towards the end of the 4th dynasty, between 2490 and 2472 before Christi. His pyramid, more modest than those of Khufu and Khafre, reaches 65 meters in height, but still reflects royal prestige. Located southwest of the other two, it follows the same logic: a valley temple, a covered causeway, and a funerary temple adjoining the pyramid. Some structures are built with particular care in the choice of materials, notably the pink granite from Aswan, providing an additional touch of refinement. Several satellite pyramids, smaller in size, seem intended for members of the royal family. The inscriptions and statues discovered in the remains reveal an evolution in iconography, as evidenced by the triads, where Mycerinus appears surrounded by protective goddesses. Despite reduced dimensions, the complex is no less ambitious, highlighting the sacred vocation of the pharaoh as a guarantor of prosperity. Historians still debate the reasons for reducing the monumental scale: economic constraints, new religious inclinations, or a mere desire to innovate. In any case, Mycerinus's pyramid marks the end of an era of controlled gigantism, paving the way for other dynasties that would replicate or modify certain architectural principles. The works undertaken during this reign hint at a still powerful dynasty, but one in search of new forms of funerary expression. When examining the design of the Sphinx, it is essential to understand the geological particularities of the Giza Plateau, located on the Libyan edge of the Nile Valley. Originally, the builders of the Egyptian Old Kingdom had a vast expanse of Eocene limestone formed during the Makatam period. This rock presents uneven strata, some more resistant than others, and it is precisely this contrast that dictated some of the architectural choices in the elaboration of the Colossus. The Makatam limestones are classified into successive beds, often distinguishable to the naked eye by color or texture variations. The more compact layers, notably located in the upper part, are characterized by increased hardness. These were used to sculpt the head of the Sphinx, ensuring better resistance to weathering and wind movements. In contrast, the softer beds situated below form the majority of the body and remain particularly vulnerable to erosion. Beyond the careful selection of the strata, the enterprise of uncovering the future Sphinx was not done in a conceptual void. The royal engineers of the 4th dynasty, during the time of King Khafre, identified a rocky promontory ideally suited to transformation into a monumental statue. The exposed surface already indicated the presence of more resistant rock in the heights, while the lower, more crumbly levels would be cleared to shape the body and dig out the enclosure. The Sphinx's enclosure, often described as a gigantic pit, constitutes one of the most fascinating elements of this pharaonic endeavor. it was excavated from the rock to extract blocks necessary for the construction of neighboring structures, such as the Sphinx Temple or the Valley Temple associated with Khafre's pyramid. By proceeding this way, they optimized both space and resources, since each block removed from the enclosure found its use in nearby construction. To obtain these limestone blocks, the teams of stonecutters proceeded in sections, tracing horizontal and vertical cut lines. The tools of the period, made of copper or slightly harder alloys, required meticulous and repeated work. Subsequently, some blocks extracted from the enclosure were carefully shaped, transported on sleds coated with grease or damp clay, and then placed in the external walls of the temples, completed with granite cladding imported from Aswan. This open-air quarry had a direct impact on the plateau's morphology. As the extraction progressed, a rectangular depression was formed around the spur constituting the Sphinx. The walls were adjusted to allow access to the bottom while leaving a high enough base, intended both to support the monument and define the statue's final height. At each stage, foremen took into account the rock quality and the strata cohesion. Parallelly, the Sphinx's orientation towards the east proved crucial for the solar rites at the heart of Egyptian society. Every morning, the sun rises in the axis of the statue's gaze, thus linking the royal figure to the daily rebirth of the star. This configuration served not only a cosmic symbolism, but also facilitated the organization of morning liturgies, orchestrated in the temples and extended at the foot of the colossus in a cycle of worship that exalted the king's power and the strength of the deities. This alignment also reflects the desire to connect the Sphinx to Khafre's funerary complex, particularly through the processional roadway leading from the Valley Temple to the pyramid. Although the Sphinx is often situated under Khafre's reign, some historians and archaeologists have hypothesized an earlier dating. Nevertheless, most archaeological evidence indicates that the arrangement of the Valley Temple, the Sphinx, and the causeway belong to a single unified program. From the causeway, the pilgrim or priest advanced in a meticulously crafted scenography. After leaving the banks of the Nile, one entered a sacred space where the Valley Temple walls, built with colossal blocks, established an atmosphere of solemnity. The dark corridors and hypostyle halls gradually guided towards the light until reaching the Sphinx area. There, the monumental face of the God King seemed to emerge from the very rock, confirming the idea of a fusion between nature and divine power. The choice of a lion with a human head draws from Egyptian iconography, which places great importance on the representation of animal power associated with sovereignty and the mastery of intelligence. The lion embodies brute strength, nocturnal vigilance, and the ability to protect the royal territory. By affixing a human head to it, the Egyptians synthesized the wisdom of the pharaoh and his divine dimension, while highlighting his role as the guarantor of cosmic and social order. In religious tradition, the Sphinx is sometimes called Hor-em-Akhet, meaning Horus of the horizon. This name emphasizes the role of mediation between heaven and earth, as it is a form of Horus, the sacred falcon. Horus, the son of Osiris, is traditionally linked to legitimate royalty and victory over chaos. By taking on the aspect of a lion, coupled with a royal face, the Sphinx thus becomes the earthly agent of divine protection, watching over the necropolis and asserting the authority of the sovereign. Later, under the influence of growing solar cults and a theology that exalts Re, the Sphinx would also be assimilated to Re-Horakti, which means Re-Horus of the horizon. This fusion further reinforces the idea that the monarch is the guarantor of the solar course and the cycle of life. Later inscriptions, notably during the New Kingdom, retain the trace of this theological evolution and confirm the central place of the Sphinx in the Egyptian religious sphere, making it a point of convergence for celestial forces. The initial stages of shaping the Sphinx involved carving out the contours of the rock to determine the exact footing of the future statue. The sculptors, following precise guidelines, began by modeling the head, taking advantage of the hardest layer to carve the nemes, this emblematic royal headdress. The facial expression, now partially eroded, could have featured finer details originally, such as folds around the eyes or a slight smile, emphasizing the serene power of the pharaoh. Once the head was roughly hewn, the team had to work on the body, where the softer layers offered less resistance, but required increased vigilance to avoid cracks and crumbling. The front legs, long and stretched forward, were excavated by creating successive steps to maintain the stability of the rock. At each stage, the foreman controlled the progress of the work site, adapting cutting methods and debris removal, while the craftsmen constantly adjusted their technique to adhere to the initial design. Within the enclosure itself, the walls were reshaped to create a particular scenic effect. The builders sought to create a contrast between the monument, almost sculpted in the round, and the high rock walls, which enclosed the site in a mineral setting. The dimensions of this pit, carefully calibrated, allowed the massive silhouette of the Sphinx to be highlighted. Between the interplay of shadow and light throughout the day, this scenography reinforced the sacred aura linked to the royal presence. The reign of Khafre, around 2520 to 2490 before Christi, marks the peak of monumental royal architecture on the Giza Plateau near Memphis, the ancient capital. The sculpture of the Great Sphinx holds a central place there. According to most specialists, the giant statue, carved from the rock substrate, was shaped under the authority of this pharaoh, son or successor of Khufu. To achieve this impressive result, a work site had to be organized, mobilizing stonecutters, sculptors, and priests. The traces of tools and the rock's morphology suggest several logistical and spiritual stages. At the time, erecting such an edifice involved technical know-how to shape the stone and a fine understanding of the prevailing winds and surrounding sand. The work site unfolded on both a practical and a sacred level. The first essential milestone was to clear the pit intended to accommodate the body of the Sphinx. Quarry workers and stonecutters conscientiously chose the most appropriate limestone strata, considering the rock quality and any potential fractures. In this confined space, they dug vertically around the future silhouette, creating a sort of circular trench. As the blocks were extracted, the general outline of the statue in progress became more readable. Often, the removed materials were used as fill material for the circulation ramps or were transported to adjoining temple sites. The idea was to optimize each stone based on its density, consistency, and ornamental potential. A team of artisans then proceeded with the initial modeling of the head, considered a visual and proportional reference. It guided the overall dimensions of the body and ensured the aesthetic balance of the whole. On this basis, the sculptors could adjust the scale of the paws and the torso, taking into account the desired perspective. This sequential approach limited errors and anticipated the structural constraints imposed by the rock itself. After this phase of clearing, carving the head was the most delicate step. It was necessary to sculpt a majestic human face, a symbol of royal power, on a potentially fragile block of limestone, the Egyptian construction sites of the 3rd millennium. before Christ had various tools, including hard wooden mallets, copper or arsenical bronze chisels, as well as picks carved from stone. Blacksmiths conscientiously worked the alloys to strengthen the blade's solidity, while workers regularly sharpened their tools with natural abrasives. The Egyptians were already familiar with the use of different percussion techniques, whether indirect or direct percussion. Artisans gradually shaped the curvature of the chin, the oval of the cheeks, and the shape of the headdress, ensuring the coherence between the upper part and what would become the symbolic twist of the royal nemes. When the head area reached a satisfactory initial stage, they moved on to a rough sketch of the shoulders and front paws, which had to extend harmoniously forward, matching the overall surface of the rock. In parallel, compacted earth and rubble ramps allowed workers to access the upper levels. Wooden scaffolding, composed of assembled beams, was sometimes erected to work on the highest parts of the statue, notably the top of the headdress and the area located at the back of the head. The lifting efforts, although less considerable than they would have been for separate blocks, required rigorous organization. It was crucial to regularly clear the rubble without obstructing the next phase of modeling. Construction supervisors, often specialist scribes, noted the progress and distributed tasks according to each person's skills. Some teams handled the rough work, while others refined the final sculpture. For the lower part of the Sphinx, care was taken to consolidate the rock on the sides, sometimes by reshaping the walls of the pit to avoid landslides or collapses. This action of wall reshaping also supplied blocks for the Sphinx Temple or the Valley Temple of Khafre, whose interior walls included monumental orthostats, later covered with pink granite from Aswan or carefully polished alabaster. In these temples, the basic structure often consisted of limestone cores extracted on site, as the Giza Plateau offered an abundance of local stone. However, to give the whole a solemn character, facing stones made of pink granite or alabaster, imported from Aswan or other distant quarries, were added. These megalithic blocks, sometimes weighing several dozen tons, were carefully adjusted to form a smooth and imposing facade. Such orthostats stood the entire height of the walls, creating a spectacular mineral ambiance within the temple. The interior decorations discreet, often played on contrasts of color and on the light filtering through the roof. The priests could thus conduct their rituals in front of large royal statues, sometimes made from the same pink granite, confirming the importance of the solar cult. The use of alabaster at the lower levels emphasized the sacred dimension of the sanctuary, as this lighter material reflected the light and conveyed connotations of purity. Around the Sphinx, one could imagine processions linking the Valley Temple to the Upper Temple, traversing the sacred space under the watchful eye of the Colossus, now standing, carved from the rock, as a vigilant guardian. Once the general shape of the statue was achieved, the finishing touches were of particular importance in Khafre's project. Sometimes, a fine limestone plaster was applied to certain parts in order to unify the surface and mask any irregularities resulting from the carving. Reliefs or details could be added, and it is not excluded that pigments were used to enhance the face or certain symbolic attributes. Although traces of coloration are rare today and often invisible to the naked eye, some analyses suggest the residual presence of ochres. These pigments, applied to the plaster, would have given the Sphinx a particular glow under the ancient Egyptian sun. Nonetheless, the bare stone, from the limestone layers of the plateau, remained the dominant visual element. From a hydrometeorological standpoint, the construction sites of the Old Kingdom were not unaware of the erosive effects of sand-laden winds. They therefore employed methods to shape the contours of the enclosure around the Sphinx in order to trap volatile particles. Protective embankments could be arranged, while the walls, trimmed at a judicious angle, reduced wind speed. Thus, Khafre's team optimized the preservation of his colossus, intended to endure through the ages. Finally, the installation of a true cultic statuary around the Sphinx symbolized the project's ceremonial completion. As a Sphinx guardian, it held a protective function, watching over the entrance of the funerary complex and, by extension, the cosmic cycles the deceased king was to preserve. Offerings and ceremonies took place in the adjoining temples, where priests laid out trays laden with bread, beer, and beef, essential elements of the funerary rites. Votive stelae, now lost or fragmentary, likely bore inscriptions dedicated to Khafre and the solar deities, emphasizing the intimate connection between the monarchy and the divine sphere. The Sphinx, carved directly from the rock, presented itself as a living incarnation of dynastic continuity, reaffirming the pharaoh's authority over the cosmic order. The priests, responsible for its spiritual guardianship, took turns maintaining the cult, performing libations, and singing hymns honoring the strength and wisdom of the sovereign. Through this colossal statue, the image of the king endured in the collective consciousness, supported by a theology where the lion expressed controlled ferocity and the human head enlightened reason. The entire construction project, from the initial clearing of the pit to the final ritual adjustments, illustrates the technical and religious sophistication of the Old Kingdom under the Fourth Dynasty. As the Old Kingdom came to an end towards the close of the Sixth Dynasty, the Central Egyptian Authority gradually disintegrated. This critical moment, conventionally called the First Intermediate Period, saw pharaonic power fragment into various regional centers, each attempting to control territories of varying sizes. The grand construction projects that had characterized the Old Kingdom were then suspended due to insufficient resources and a lack of unified political direction. In this context of retreat, the vast funerary complex built so far on the Giza Plateau is not spared from the consequences of the decline. The teams of stonecutters, officiating priests, and specialized artisans gradually leave the area, no longer supported by the organization and backing of a strong state. As a result, the Sphinx, the impressive stone sentry erected by the Fourth Dynasty, finds itself increasingly isolated. Regular ceremonies and continuous maintenance work struggle to be sustained. Meanwhile, natural phenomena contribute to rapidly altering the appearance of the complex. The prevailing winds, coming from the north-northeast, lift clouds of fine particles that accumulate in every crevice. The Giza Plateau, with its particular topography of limestone hills and depressions, gradually transforms into a vast sand trap. The enclosure carved around the Sphinx, dug to shape its body, especially facilitates the accumulation of aeolian deposits. Thus begins the gradual sanding up. During the Middle Kingdom, some dynasties managed to re-establish a relative political unity around capitals such as Thebes. However, the attention given to the monumental sites of the Old Kingdom remains uneven. The Sphinx, a prestigious symbol of a bygone era, sparks sporadic signs of maintenance. Isolated testimonies, in the form of administrative documents or graffiti, suggest that rare groups of workers undertook a partial clearing around the statue. However, archaeological databases remain incomplete. Uncertainties persist. The fluctuating memory surrounding the Sphinx is also expressed in religious practices. Although the imperial cult of the Fourth Dynasty is now extinct, the figure of Hor-em-Akhet, sometimes identified with Ra-Horakhti, the solar form of the falcon god, Horus associated with the horizon, is still mentioned in some inscriptions from the time. This survival testifies to a strong symbolic continuity, even when the political context scarcely favors the mobilization of major cults. The rites, more discreet, maintain tenuous links with solar ideology, a preserved heritage. In this period of the Middle Kingdom, the piety towards the Sphinx is sometimes manifested by modest offerings, such as small stelae or votive objects placed at the foot of the statue. The priests responsible for maintaining these devotions, presumably few in number, were likely part of larger colleges devoted to other major deities. However, the archaeological site only yields fragmentary testimonies, making it difficult to accurately reconstruct the modalities of worship. The essential remains the persistence of the solar symbol. During the New Kingdom, corresponding to the 18th and 19th dynasties, the Sphinx of Giza benefited from a renewed focus by the pharaohs, priests, and royal administration, keen on honoring the great figures of the Old Kingdom. Although the monument had undergone long centuries of partial burial, the memory of its imposing silhouette remained vivid. Ancient inscriptions already reported its sacred nature, linked to the solar and royal god Hor-em-Akhet, sometimes assimilated to Ra-Horakhti. However, these mythological religious references no longer sufficed when the accumulated sand around the body hindered the celebration of rituals. Faced with the height of the dunes, the head of the colossus emerged as an isolated promontory. The rulers of the New Kingdom, sensitive to the idea of reviving Egypt's grandeur, perceived in this site an ideal center to assert their legitimacy, while claiming to be heirs of the builders of the Old Kingdom. At the heart of this momentum, a famous story is attached to Thutmose IV, around 1400 before Christi. Even before reclaiming the crown, this young prince is said to have experienced a dream episode linking his destiny to the Sphinx. According to the account transcribed later, Thutmose IV, tired from a hunt or an expedition near the plateau, made a stop near the great stone head. As he dozed in the shade of the monument, he reportedly received a divine visit in his dream from the Sphinx itself, presenting itself as a sacred being buried under the sand. The vision promised him royalty if he agreed to clear the Colossus and restore it to its majestic guardian state. Motivated by this prophecy, Thutmose IV ordered significant clearance work as soon as he came to power. Chronicles of the time report that he wished to establish a pious link, aiming to prove that he received his authority directly through the Sphinx. To commemorate this event, he erected the famous Dream Stele, also known as the Stele of the Dream, between the statue's front paws. This monument in granite or sandstone consecrates the sacramental pact made between a sovereign-to-be and the great protective entity. The work undertaken by Thutmose IV was not limited to mere clearance. Archaeological remains suggest that consolidation actions were undertaken on the enclosure walls, notably to protect the weakened flanks of the Sphinx and limit erosion. Limestone blocks, possibly reused from earlier structures or specifically cut, were used to fill cracks and reinforce the lines of the body. These arrangements met a dual requirement. On the one hand, restoring the visual power of the Colossus by removing the sand. On the other, recalling a cult that, since the great days of the Old Kingdom, recognized in the human-headed lion a manifestation of solar energy capable of intervening in human life. By clearing and then stabilizing the statue, Thutmose IV thus laid the foundations for a formal reactivation of the Hor-em-Akhet cult, with likely ceremonies, offerings, and the regular visit of priests who saw in the Sphinx a privileged point of contact with the divine sphere. Beyond this emblematic project, Other great pharaohs of the 18th dynasty reinforced the Sphinx's place in royal theology. Amenhotep II reigned around 1427 to 1401 before Christ. His reign predates that of Thutmose IV, but several sources suggest that once the site was revitalized, particular attention may have retrospectively been attributed to this sovereign in the Sphinx's surroundings by the erection of steles or official mentions. Later, Amenhotep III, a pharaoh renowned for his majestic artistic and cultic production, is also said to have supported the maintenance of the monument. History has not fully preserved the trace of his direct interventions, but it seems plausible that this colossal edifice, now freed on the surface, served as a symbolic pole for solar theology. Indeed, Amenhotep III considered himself the Sun King, multiplying temples dedicated to Amun-Re, Re-Herakti, and other divine forms. In this context, including the Sphinx in a circuit of offerings and ceremonies, reinforced the presentation of the pharaoh as a guarantor of cosmic order and intermediary between gods and men. The inscriptions, now fragmentary, and certain fragments of steles unearthed in the area, could corroborate this interest, even if the datable attributes have sometimes disappeared over the millennia. The 19th dynasty marked a new turning point in Egypt's history, with the arrival of builder pharaohs like Seti I and Ramesses II. Both sovereigns showed concern in consolidating the legacy of previous generations to legitimize their own reigns. The Giza site, embodying the glory of the Old Kingdom, provided an ideal ground to create this bridge between an already revered ancient past and an ambitious present. Seti I, reigning from 1290 to 1279 before Christ, could then supervise or commission new clearance operations near the Sphinx, or at least oversee the site's maintenance. Although direct testimonies about him are rare, marks on blocks from this period, as well as tool traces post-dating the renovations of Thutmose IV, suggest that a project was undertaken to consolidate cracks or restore certain parts of the monument in direct contact with the ground. Ramses II, successor of Seti I, an iconic ruler of Egypt, led an architectural and religious program of unprecedented scale. While he is best known for his temples at Abu Simbel, his expansion of Karnak, and his numerous martial representations, he did not neglect the symbolic high places of the past, including Giza. The Sphinx, already honored since Thutmose IV, was part of Ramses II's strategy to situate himself in the lineage of the founding pharaohs while enhancing his own aura. Inscriptions or stelae attributed to this period, sometimes found within the enclosure, reveal a concern for preserving the continuity of the cult. It is possible that in these interventions, collapsed or worn parts of the Colossus's body were occasionally replaced. The addition of blocks, the regularization of the stone, and the use of new mortars demonstrate an effort to preserve this image of divine power. A notable figure under Ramses II was Kamwaset, one of the pharaoh's sons, often considered the first Egyptologist in history. Kamwaset served as the high priest of Ptah in Memphis and distinguished himself by his keen interest in earlier monuments. He restored prestigious sites, engraved or re-engraved inscriptions, and sought to give visibility to the great works of the Old Kingdom in a spirit of piety and patrimonial tribute. The annals recount that he applied himself to cataloging and honoring ancient foundations, revealing a curiosity for traces of the past. It is very likely that he turned his attention to the Sphinx, whether to inscribe dedications, complete or rectify some collapsed parts, or direct ceremonies in front of this silent colossus. Although no text precisely confirms the extent of his work on site, the modern historian sees Kamwaset as the symbol of a quasi-scholarly approach, motivated by respect for tradition and the desire to revive the glory of the ancestors. In the perspective of ritual sonography, the Sphinx regained its full significance as a guardian of the plateau, but also as a nodal point in solar processions at the time. Archaeologists studying the state of the causeways and surrounding temples hypothesized that in the 18th and 19th dynasties, processions might have started from landings on the Nile, bringing priests and followers to the valley temples. These cult complexes linked to the pyramids of Khafre or Khufu, then continued to the Sphinx before moving up to the plateau. The priests, dressed in ritual attire, recited hymns, repeated litanies of praise, and dedicated offerings to the Sphinx, identified with a form of Ra. The votive stelae deposited, some bearing the names of individuals or officials, testified to the desire to leave a tangible imprint of their devotion. They occasionally feature formulas addressed to Hor-em-Akhet, as well as engraved scenes representing the pharaoh offering a vase of offerings. The participation of notables, scribes, and some Egyptian artisans reflected the will to express their loyalty to the royalty and the divinity united in a single symbol. Construction anecdotes concerning this historical interval highlight the recurring nature of interventions. The sand, always quick to accumulate, required periodic clearances. The pharaohs would send teams of workers, whose composition could vary, quarrymen, stonemasons, laborers, supervisors, and scribes, in charge of recording the progress of the work. Tool marks from the Ramesside era are sometimes visible on certain block tiers, revealing cuts or reshaping to fit a stone into a specific recess of the enclosure. Remnants of rudimentary ramps made of compacted earth or mud bricks have been observed in Giza, although the precise dating of these structures remains complex. However, it seems clear that when deterioration became too visible, damaged areas were quickly repaired to prevent the collapse of stone fragments or the external facade. Sometimes, teams resorted to reusing blocks from earlier monuments. Within the Sphinx enclosure, some retaining walls bear inscriptions of various origins, indicating that already engraved stones were taken from other structures and repositioned to support the wall. Such practices were common in Egypt, where the reuse of blocks allowed for an economy of resources and saved time during major construction projects. The artisans were ingenious, filling the gaps with gypsum or plaster-based mortars, aiming to ensure a certain solidity to the weakened sections. Similarly, the use of larger, heavier blocks, often placed at the lower part, was intended to counterweight the pressure from the sands, preventing the enclosure from collapsing into the cleared area. The reconsolidations, identifiable by different and sometimes rough seams, demonstrate the urgency faced by workers tasked with containing erosion. The hieroglyphs indicate that royal piety went hand in hand with technical expertise. Honoring the Sphinx glorified the ancestors, but the rock's sides also had to be preserved to continue religious practice. Construction efforts were made without necessarily erasing all previous marks, such that tool streaks, dowel holes, or signs of uncertainty in the block cutting sometimes overlap. The pharaohs of the 18th and 19th dynasties, proud of their achievements, likely saw the composite nature of the enclosure as a reflection of the monument's long history, rather than a state of deterioration. Each intervention added a layer to the architectural biography of the Sphinx. Certain inscriptions in demotic or hieratic, engraved on interior blocks, perhaps reveal the name of specific projects, mention religious dates, or celebrate operations carried out during a solar festival. Other steles, more official, hieroglyphic, and carefully decorated, reported the presence of nobles or administrators whose function was to oversee the local cult, sustained by agricultural donations or taxes levied on the surrounding villages. Not all archives have survived, but one can imagine records of ration distribution to these workers, with bread, beer, or other essential goods managed by royal stewards sent to the site. The construction protocols, like those implemented under the Old Kingdom, remained relevant, reflecting the state's enduring ability to mobilize workforce and resources. Over time, the activity around the Sphinx was not limited to a strict cult interest. It also encompassed a political dimension. Consolidated and maintained, the monument contributed to the sovereign's legitimization by demonstrating a direct lineage with great past dynasties. In the collective imagination, keeping the Sphinx standing was to preserve one of the kingdom's protectors, emblem of the rising sun and cosmic balance. Ceremonies at the foot of the Colossus, captivating officiants and spectators, reinforced the sense of order and prosperity promised by the pharaoh. The processions, also endowed with a diplomatic dimension, allowed the king's power to be demonstrated before his peers and the local elites. The third intermediate period, spanning approximately from 1070 to 1664. Before Christi, saw Egypt go through a succession of fragmented powers and complex alliances. After the gradual collapse of the New Kingdom, the country fragmented into several political centers, some of which were controlled by military leaders or princes of Libyan origin settled in the Delta. Egyptians, already accustomed to migrations for centuries, thus saw new dynasties consolidate from foreign warrior elites, appropriating pharaonic heritage to establish their legitimacy. Within this context, attention to the grand ancient sanctuaries, including the Giza Plateau, was maintained sporadically. The temples of Lower Egypt sometimes benefited from restoration work aimed at consolidating their cultic and political roles. The Sphinx, often partially buried under shifting sands, continued to feature in devotional narratives, reflecting a persistent attachment of rulers to sacred symbols that testified to the ancients' power. Under the Libyan dynasties, identified mainly with the 22nd and 23rd dynasties, there is a scattered maintenance of ritual practices around prestigious monuments. These dynasties, whose members sometimes claim traditional pharaonic titles, strive for the continuity of funerary rites and the veneration of the great solar deities. In this environment, the Sphinx is not necessarily at the center of political administration, but still embodies an invaluable monumental presence. Fragmentary inscriptions, noted on blocks dispersed around the perimeter, indicate that offerings or limited ceremonies may have taken place at various times. The Libyan priests, particularly those from priestly lineages in Memphis or Heliopolis, emphasize the antiquity of these sites to assert their spiritual authority. However, such practices do not hold the same magnitude as during the great dynasties of the New Kingdom, and restoration efforts often focus on more accessible temples close to power centers. Nevertheless, even in times of political tension, the figure of the great lion with a human head remains an immutable landmark in the religious imagination. In the 8th century before Christ, Egypt is again subject to upheavals when the kings of Napata, of Kushite origin, intervene in the north. The Kushites, gathered under the 25th dynasty, managed to unify part of the Egyptian territory around a political and spiritual project aimed at restoring the grandeur of the ancient pharaohs. Witnesses of this momentum, certain construction sites in the Theban region and further north demonstrate a desire to restore the cosmic order symbolized by the Egyptian concept of Ma'at. The Kushite kings, such as Piye and Taharka, commemorate the legitimacy of their reign by direct references to the solar universe and the Egyptian dynastic heritage. Following such a policy, it can be assumed that some occasional interventions were still carried out near the Sphinx, such as the refurbishment of small chapels or the establishment of modest votive installations. Even if the direct archaeological evidence remains fragmentary, the Kushites' attraction to the great symbols of Egypt reveals that these rulers aspired to associate themselves with the protective powers linked to Re-Horakti and the sacred memory of Giza. When the 25th dynasty ends under Assyrian pressure, Egypt enters a new phase of reorganization. On this occasion, the late period begins, often dated between 664 and 332 before Christi. The first dynasty to mark this period is the Sate, known as the 26th dynasty, with its cradle in Sais in the Delta. Its kings, notably Psamtik pharaohs, seek to re-establish unified and stable control over the entire country. At the same time, there is a renewed interest in the monumental heritage. The Sate rulers, aware of the symbolic importance of ancient edifices, finance various restoration campaigns across Egypt. They consider that the glory of past monuments reflects on them, reinforcing the perception of an unbroken continuity of the pharaonic function. At Giza, this intent is notably manifested by the restoration of certain structures associated with the valley temples, or by the installation of new commemorative steles that emphasize the link between the reigning sovereign and the famous builder kings of previous centuries. The Sate priestly circles, known for their erudite compilations, strive to collect and comment on the myths related to the sacred topography of the country. In the grand temple libraries, mythographic collections and cosmological treatises, written in hieroglyphic script punctuated with cryptic references, proliferate. The Sphinx, long identified as an emanation of Re-Horakti, or as Hor-Em-Akhet, is integrated into new theological exegeses. Some priests draw parallels between the daily solar cycle and the imposing lion statue facing the rising sun. They also sometimes associate Atum, the creative deity often depicted as the setting god, highlighting the cosmic loop that conceals behind the horizon both birth and death. This reinterpretation broadens the symbolic dimension of the Sphinx, now perceived as a pivot between different forms of solar manifestation. The idea of the ancestor sphinx appears in some documents from the late period, where it is described as an original colossus, shaped during a heroic age. In these narratives, the image of the sphinx stems from divine architecture modeled by the gods themselves, or realized under the direct guidance of Thoth and men inspired by the wisdom of the supernatural world. This vision, which magnifies the primordial nature of the monument, allows the ruling dynasties to connect to it in order to reclaim a share of the legendary glory. The priests officiating in the site sanctuaries, aware of this powerful symbolic charge, invite elites and notables to contribute to the maintenance and repair of these ancestral sites. Collective offerings, sometimes accompanied by dedicatory inscriptions, materialize this continuous link with cosmic forces. Thus, when the court decided to finance a repair, such as the addition of limestone blocks along the pause or the erection of a small chapel, it justified it by the utility of preserving the mediation of the Sphinx between the divine world and the human realm. The contribution of the priests to these endeavors fits into a broader dynamic of cultural renewal. Highly educated, these men document in their writings many oral traditions and archaic references while establishing new rituals to safeguard social peace. It is not uncommon in some oracles for the Sphinx to be designated as a possible arbiter of conflicts, referring to the immanent justice, symbolized by Ma'at. The Saites, seeking stability after a long period of fragmentation, rely on all this sacred heritage to strengthen the loyalty of the provinces. In Memphis and Sais, religious colleges work on commenting on ancient traditional texts, which they purify or reshape to align the royal ideology with popular fervor. References to Re, Adam, and Horus remain central. They provide a solid, conceptual framework in which the erection or consolidation of the Sphinx is understood as the reaffirmation of the fundamental power of solar light and its incarnation on Earth. In parallel, the elites, unsettled by the evolving power dynamics in the region, find in the Sphinx a symbolic pillar that allows them to represent themselves as direct heirs. Whether through public rites instituted in the capital or more confidential ceremonies maintained locally, there is a discernible intent to connect the present time with the sacred aura of the foundational pharaonic times. The ancestor, embodied by the Sphinx, is thus not just a monument set in stone, but an active mediator between the visible and the invisible. Periods of crisis or transformation precisely offer the opportunity to reinvest this architectural totem to strengthen national cohesion. The late inscriptions, even if rare, show that the pharaonic institution seeks to consolidate with the sanctuaries of Giza a pact with cosmic forces, a pact of which the Leonine statue remains the unquestionable guarantor. Beyond its restorative interest, the Sphinx then undergoes several more or less esoteric reinterpretations, where its kinship with Atum, master of creation, or with other forms of Horus, protector of the sovereign, is invoked. In some accounts from this time, the statue takes on the role of a redemptive intercessor, capable of intervening in earthly affairs to remind of faults or call for fidelity to the traditional gods. The sate officiants, trained in interpretative techniques combining astronomical observation and mythological exegesis, nurture this more mysterious aspect of the Sphinx. The offering tables set up near the paws testify to a still living ritual activity, even if the cult may not have the solar extent it might have known in earlier times. As the late period deepens, other dynasties succeed the 26th without always managing to maintain such a stable state. The rulers of the 27th dynasty, of Achaemenid Persian origin, attempt in their turn to associate themselves with pharaonic symbols, but encounter strong internal resistance. Despite these vicissitudes, the idea of the Sphinx as a guarantor of cosmic order remains anchored in collective memory. It is not uncommon for the figure of the great human-headed lion to be mentioned during official ceremonies in hymns, celebrating the so-called eternal presence it represents. The priests officiating in the temples of the Delta and the Nile Valley perpetuate the documentation accumulated under the Saites, adapting their liturgies if the king's authority at the time is contested. Under the guidance of these educated elites, the Sphinx maintains the reputation of being a silent repository of the secrets of creation. The Ptolemaic period opens in 305, before Christi, when Ptolemy the Soter proclaims himself king of Egypt and founds the Lagid dynasty. This Greek monarchy, lasting until 30 Sar. Before Christi, with the death of Cleopatra VII, sees the installation of a new ruling elite from Alexander's Macedonian entourage, while maintaining some of the traditional pharaonic structures. In this bicultural state, administration relies on the parallel use of Greek and Egyptian, whether it involves hieroglyphs or the more cursive form of demotic script. Official documents are often written bilingually. Greek bureaucrats, supported by Egyptian officials, oversee tax collection and infrastructure maintenance, while the temples retain their central role in religious life and the management of agricultural domains. Under the Lagid monarchy, the major sanctuaries of the Nile Valley benefit from expansion or embellishment work commissioned by the kings and queens of the dynasty. For example, the Temple of Horus at Edfu is largely built starting in 237 before Christi under Ptolemy III Euergetes, then continued under his successors. These achievements are part of an effort to legitimize royal power before the Egyptian population, as the sovereign is perceived as the direct successor of the ancient pharaohs. The Lagids thus adopt pharaonic attributes, fund sumptuous rituals, and have themselves depicted in Egyptian attire, particularly on temple walls, where Greek inscriptions and hieroglyphic formulas coexist to remind of the hybrid nature of the regime. the Nile remains the vital axis of the country, controlled by an administration attentive to the maintenance of canals and hydraulic infrastructures. The products from the countryside, collected partly as taxes, feed the Greek cities of Egypt and exports to the neighboring Mediterranean. In this context of cultural exchanges, the Giza site, a prestigious heritage of the Old Kingdom, arouses both fascination and curiosity. The Ptolemaic kings do not completely abandon the funerary monuments of the Old Kingdom, but their interest primarily lies in the reactivation of certain solar cults. Temples dedicated to the solar triad, including Re-Harakti and related gods, hold a symbolic place in the religiosity of this period. The Great Sphinx of Giza, for its part, still appears rooted in ancient traditions. Egyptian priests consider it a manifestation of the god Hor-em-Akhet, associated with solar power. However, the Greek court, which does not systematically seek to restore everything, organizes occasional ceremonies to reconnect with the mystical power associated with the plateau. Despite its desire to connect with the pharaonic lineage, the Lagid monarchy focuses its resources primarily on new architectural projects, rather than an exhaustive rehabilitation of older monuments. An astonishing phenomenon of antiquarian curiosity also arises among certain thinkers and travelers who speak Greek or later Latin. Geographers and historians who travel through Egypt during the Ptolemaic era or shortly after leave written testimonies about the country, describing its colossal monuments for a Mediterranean audience eager for exotism. Authors like Diodorus of Sicily, who visits Egypt at the end of the 1st century before Christ, marvel at the size of the pyramids, mention the Sphinx without always giving it a precise interpretation, and sometimes relay local legends about its significance. Diodorus, seeking to provide a complete portrait of the country, reports that the Egyptians keep many ancient traditions, even if the role of the Sphinx remains partly shrouded in mystery to him. Strabo, another Greek geographer active under Augustus, also travels through Egypt and describes the configuration of the Giza Plateau, questioning the exact function of the monumental statue. The accounts of these travelers mix fascination, technical descriptions, and speculations inherited from the Greek imagination, where the figure of the Sphinx refers to another myth, that of the winged creature, posing riddles at Thebes. However, the enigmatic colossus of the Giza Plateau has almost nothing in common with the Greek Sphinx, which is feminine and bears different attributes, but the coincidence of the name sometimes causes confusion. Mentions of the Sphinx by Greco-Roman authors reflect both admiration and incomprehension. Some see it as a mark of a distant golden age, when the Egyptians would have accomplished unmatched architectural feats. Others still wonder about the exact role of the statue. Is it a temple ornament, a funerary monument, a purely symbolic work dedicated to a specific god, or an enigmatic open-air altar? Hypotheses abound, fueled by accounts from Egyptian priests and scholarly speculations from Alexandria or other centers of study. In any case, the impressive mass of the sculpture, carved out of the limestone rock of the plateau, stimulates the imagination and reinforces the idea that Egypt holds ancient secrets that only an in-depth knowledge of its language and rituals could unveil. Several visitors note the finesse of the face and the majesty of the gaze, despite the ravages of time. Some reliefs indicate that there may have been residual traces of ancient paintings or pigments here and there, although erosion and sands have long since erased most of the original colors. Despite this relative lack of interest, the Sphinx, in the collective imagination, remains a symbol of the power of the ancient kings of Egypt and continues to exert a form of prestige. Across the Greek world, Many have heard of the Great Pyramids and the enigmatic statue with the body of a lion. Sailors, merchants, and diplomats mention these monuments during their stops, sometimes exaggerating their dimensions or turning their memories into marvelous anecdotes. The scholars of the court, curious about everything related to the universe and geography, keep some notes in the libraries of Alexandria, but these data remain scattered. Some skeptics even doubt the extreme antiquity of the Sphinx and think its dating could be more recent, due to a lack of irrefutable evidence. Others, on the contrary, rank it among the oldest effigies of Egypt, citing the very ancient hieroglyphs that describe Horemakhet, vanished from common rituals. Within the Lagid monarchy, the coexistence of diverse communities, Macedonian Greeks, mercenary soldiers from other Mediterranean regions, Egyptians from various backgrounds, creates a cultural ferment where the question of the pharaonic past is regularly posed. The priests of the solar sanctuaries, aware of the symbolic significance of Giza, maintain a religious discourse that connects the reign of the Ptolemies to the legitimate pharaonic lineage. To reinforce this continuity in the minds of the faithful, ceremonies of purification of the Sphinx and its surroundings are sometimes held, accompanied by inscriptions praising the reigning sovereign. However, these gestures remain occasional and do not constitute a vast campaign to preserve the site. Egypt, under Roman domination, became one of the most strategic provinces of the empire, notably due to its capacity to provide large quantities of wheat. Following the defeat of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium in 31 before Christo, and the capture of Alexandria by Octavian the following year, the entire Egyptian territory fell under Roman control. Emperor Augustus then inaugurated a new era. The ancient land of the pharaohs was now administered by a prefect appointed directly by Rome, and the agricultural resources of the rich Nile Delta henceforth filled the granaries intended to feed the Italian cities. This political and economic integration favored a constant flow of Roman officers, administrative agents, and merchants. Radiating from the coast and major cities like Alexandria, these contingents ventured throughout the province, stopping at major sites to leave marks and inscriptions. Travelers, driven as much by curiosity as by professional reasons, thus left traces of their passage on ancient monuments, including in Giza, where Greek and Latin graffiti remain on several points of the surrounding enclosure. The period known as Late, encompassing late antiquity and the early Islamic centuries, marks a profound shift in Egypt's religious life. During these centuries, major political changes occurred, from the Christianized Roman Empire to the arrival of Arab conquerors. This era saw the reorientation of cults, the transformation of many temples into churches or administrative spaces, as well as the modification of how populations related to their ancient monuments. The Sphinx of Giza, an emblematic monument of the pharaohs, did not escape this reconfiguration. Its symbolic role, already altered under Greco-Roman domination, continued to evolve as the new Christian faith gained ground among the inhabitants, and pagan rites were gradually abandoned in favor of cultic practices aligned with the emerging doctrines of Christianity. From the 5th century onward, bishops and hermits settled in the Memphite region, not far from the Giza Plateau. The texts of the Church Fathers of Egypt attest to a desire to combat the pagan superstitions that lingered around the ancient monuments. The Sphinx, associated with the ancient gods and cosmic beliefs, became the object of narratives condemning the idolatry attached to this relic. Fervent Christians sometimes describe these monumental statues as demonic representations, seeing in their animal or semi-animal forms the deceptions of the evil one. Some ecclesiastical authors suggested that the Sphinx, by its atypical shape, might have served as a place for ritual offerings now considered heretical. However, Documentation is lacking to know in detail how the site was really used or protected during this period, as archaeological sources remain incomplete and fragmentary. The gradual transition from the Eastern Byzantine Roman Empire to Persian Sassanid control, followed by the Byzantine reconquest of Egypt in the early 7th century, once again disrupted the religious and political balance. In this interval, there is already a significant decline in traditional Egyptian cults, and the Christianization of society seems almost total. Coptic monks and priests, strong in their influence, further directed populations towards a new view of the pharaonic past. Antique buildings, deemed useless or too tied to practices judged pagan, continued to deteriorate. Situated on the edge of the desert, the Sphinx became exposed to natural erosion and the gradual abandonment of any official cult. Its imposing silhouette, once painted and regularly restored by previous dynasties, gradually blended with the surrounding sandy landscape. In 641-642, the Arab conquest of Egypt under the command of Amr ibn al-As marked the beginning of a new era in the management of the territory. This period, commonly referred to as that of nascent Islamic Egypt, was characterized by a great curiosity regarding the major architectural achievements of Egypt's past. Arab chroniclers, sometimes drawing from oral traditions, recounted the amazement of the conquerors at the pyramids and the Sphinx. Describing these monuments as wonders of the ancients, they showed a sustained respect for the technical prowess of pharaonic Egypt, even if the original religious function of these sites no longer held the same sway as in the times of solar and funerary cults. The idea of secret knowledge hidden within these structures, or of fabulous treasures placed beneath the grand edifices, spread through the collective imagination of the nascent Islamic world, fueling tales and marvelous stories. Under Arab administration, ancient temples still in use were sometimes repurposed as civilian or military buildings, while others became quarries for new constructions. However, the Sphinx could not be conveniently exploited for blocks, as it was a monumental sculpture carved directly from the limestone plateau. Despite some sporadic attempts to recover stone fragments, most of the region's inhabitants preferred not to further degrade this colossus, perceived as bearing a legendary heritage. The desert landscape of Giza, subject to the prevailing north winds, buried the body of the Sphinx under sand a little more each year, gradually reducing accessibility to the statue's paws and torso. Its face, sculpted from harder limestone, emerged to serve as a visible landmark, a mysterious beacon for the caravans traversing the area. In the decades following the conquest, the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphs managed Egypt as a strategic province of their respective empires. The establishment of new institutions and the construction of cities like Al-Fustat concentrated political attention in the Nile Delta. Rural populations continued to visit the grand monuments, sometimes to extract residual stones, sometimes to admire the past splendor of a civilization remembered only dimly. Residual Christianization persisted in certain Coptic communities, while the majority of the population gradually converted to Islam. The Sphinx, for its part, served as a visual marker in the landscape, distant enough from urban concentrations to avoid major architectural transformations, yet close enough to the valley to remain within the field of curiosity of elites and travelers. Topographically, karst phenomena and subterranean erosion occasionally transform the surroundings of the Giza Plateau. Layers of softer limestone could collapse, create small cavities, or accentuate the formation of basins where sand accumulated. This geological dynamic favored the progressive burial of the Sphinx's body, whose paws and flank were often covered by shifting dunes. the rare attempts to clear the statue were limited to occasional interventions, likely undertaken by individuals eager to explore the base or uncover supposed hiding places. The limited impact of these activities was insufficient to make the monument fully visible or maintain it systematically. Over time, the statue often found itself buried up to its shoulders, reappearing only when episodes of strong winds partially cleared the area. With the gradual emergence of local dynasties, such as the Tulunids or the Ikhshidids, Egypt gradually consolidates its political autonomy while remaining formally attached to the caliphate. The ruling princes and governors mainly focus on border defense, agricultural management, and grain supply, showing little interest in ancient ruins. Indeed, the Sphinx remains at the margins of power, subject to the whims of the climate and the beliefs of the population. In the emerging Islamic memory, however, certain emirs are intrigued by the reputation of this imposing statue. They sometimes bring scholars, astronomers, or court academics to examine ancient documents and attempt to understand the site's function. Such initiatives remain exceptional and do not lead to large-scale works. Scholars do not yet possess scientific methods comparable to modern archaeology, and their investigations often confine themselves to hypotheses based on oral narratives. The climatic conditions vary from season to season, and violent Khamsin winds sometimes partially uncover the Sphinx's flank. Anecdotes report groups of Bedouins venturing to walk between the statue's paws, noting the accumulated damage on the rock and the presence of cracks in the wall. These incursions fuel new stories that the Sphinx might harbor a secret passage to an underground palace or to the Hall of Records of Atlantis, a tenacious myth that has already appeared in other forms. In the absence of real supervision, visitors are free to take small stone fragments as talismans or souvenirs, reinforcing anthropogenic erosion. Changing political conditions and internal wars do not allow for sustained interest in conserving the Colossus. During these early centuries of Arab domination, the authorities do not implement continuous maintenance measures to free the statue from its sand casing. Political and economic priorities focus on agricultural taxation, monitoring trade routes, and building or repairing fortifications useful for defending the territory. The revenues of the Egyptian province benefit major infrastructures that the caliphs deem priority, such as irrigation canals or mosques, rather than rescue works for a monument considered pagan. Despite some spontaneous interventions by individuals, no major project aims to clear the entire Sphinx or repair its damaged parts. The very idea of restoring an ancient monument, as conceived in the modern era, does not yet exist as a public policy. Local uses of the Sphinx diversify as new stories emerge. Traveling healers sometimes claim that the stone of the Sphinx brings luck or can relieve certain ailments if one touches its flank. One hears of women coming to pray for fertility in the shadow of this half-human, half-lion effigy, inadvertently adapting very ancient votive practices to an Islamized context. Rumors circulate about the presence of protective spirits living in the rock's crevices, and it is said that those who treat the monument with respect will be rewarded in their endeavors. Other, darker legends assert that desecrators risk triggering destructive sandstorms if they damage the silhouette of the Colossus. Thus, the Sphinx continues to live in the Egyptian imagination, suspended between feudal traditions, Arab legends, and fragments of ancient pharaonic customs, even if its actual form remains largely hidden under the dunes. Superstitious practices related to the Sphinx sometimes include nocturnal rituals, conducted by groups who hope to invoke supernatural entities. The vast desert spaces, barely illuminated by the starlight, lend these scenes an irrational aspect. Some chroniclers condemn these pagan manifestations, considering they defy the strict observance of Islam. Others simply describe these rituals as folkloric survivals, without severe sanction or official approval. Whatever the case, the collective memory enriches itself with this blend of religious fears and ancient fascination, helping to perpetuate the subtle presence of the Sphinx in the popular consciousness. Far from the large cities, where religious authority is stricter, these practices sometimes spread over several generations, without a centralized power seeking to stifle them. In this universe largely dominated by the desert, caravans often consider Giza an isolated stopover before continuing south or toward the delta. Travelers exchange goods, share stories around a campfire, and discuss those pharaonic monuments they only half understand. The Sphinx, buried up to its neck by the encroaching sand, appears to first-time viewers as a silent guardian, witnessing the bygone glory of the pharaohs and the gradual fusion of ancient heritage, late Christian culture, and the burgeoning Islamic world. Tales intermingle, history is woven, and the statue becomes the emblem of a time covered by sand and faith. Among these notable witnesses is the historian and theologian Taqi al-Din Ahmad al-Makrizi, whose writings provide valuable insight into the topography and beliefs related to the Giza area. Born in Cairo, al-Makrizi devoted part of his work to describing ancient monuments, their uses, and the evolution of their perception through the centuries. His chronicles, written in Arabic, often addressed dynastic history and urban transformations, while giving a prominent place to the popular stories circulating among the locals. Regarding the Sphinx, he recounts several anecdotes that evoke the supernatural power attributed to the statue and the doctrinal confusions it provoked. Under his pen, Abu al-Hawl appears as an object of astrological interest, potentially serving as a celestial indicator or harboring esoteric secrets coveted by scholars. In this context, one of the most notable events of the Mamluk period concerns the controversial episode of the Sphinx's nose mutilation, traditionally dated to the year 1378. According to the often cited account, a Sufi named Muhammad Sa'um al-Dahr, shocked by practices he deemed idolatrous, decided to disfigure the statue's face. This act, intended as an iconoclastic move to eradicate any pagan worship, remains contentious. Some later texts describe the Sufi as a fanatic, convinced of the necessity to punish those who purportedly continued to offer tributes at the monument's base. However, the reliability of these accounts is debated among modern historians. It is nonetheless established that this destruction, whether real or partially exaggerated, occurred long before the arrival of Napoleon's army in Egypt, dispelling the popular legend, attributing the nose's disappearance to the French troops. Beyond this anecdote, the Mamluk period is characterized by a relatively discontinuous management of the Giza site. The Mamluk rulers, often preoccupied with wars, court intrigues, and maintaining order in their territories, did not seem to prioritize the conservation of ancient monuments highly. The surrounding stone quarries remained active, supplying construction projects in Cairo and other cities. The extracted blocks were used to build fortifications, mosques, or palaces, sometimes at the expense of archaeological structures. The shifting winds constantly carried sand, which eventually accumulated within the Sphinx's enclosure and on the sides of the pyramids. The local communities, focused on irrigation and economic survival, lacked the technical or financial means to preserve such a site. This resulted in the progressive silting of the statue, with only the face and the top of the body remaining partially visible. Nevertheless, the absence of a centralized maintenance program did not prevent certain circles of scholars from maintaining an interest in the relics of antiquity. Within the madrasas and academic circles of Cairo, there were occasionally learned individuals eager to understand the hidden meaning of monuments like the Sphinx and the pyramids. Several of them sought to reconcile Islamic tradition with the pharaonic heritage, which they considered either an example of ancient knowledge or a sign of past civilizations' misguidance. Astrology, very popular in certain circles, also fueled speculations. It was claimed that the Sphinx's proportions could contain astronomical keys or serve as an observatory to predict the Nile's flooding. These hypotheses, though marginal, nevertheless highlighted the persistent questioning of the function and symbolism of this imposing stone guardian. During the Ottoman era, which spans approximately from the 16th to the very beginning of the 19th century, the region of Giza and the plateau where the Great Sphinx was located remained intriguing destinations for different types of European, Middle Eastern, and Asian visitors. These travelers, often accompanied by local guides, approached the monumental statue with very diverse cultural references. Among them were pilgrims en route to the Holy Land or Muslim sacred places, as well as merchants traveling along the Nile Valley, diplomats sent by their respective courts, and sometimes adventurers drawn by the legends surrounding ancient Egypt. The accounts they left behind, in the form of journals, letters, or illustrations, testified to a growing fascination with pharaonic relics, even if their observations remained fragmentary and tinged with subjective interpretations. The Arabic texts of the time often nicknamed the statue Abu al-Hawl, which can be translated as Father of Terror, a name reflecting the amazement and mixed fear felt in the face of this half-human, half-leonine figure. This appellation circulated in the accounts of Ottoman scholars and encouraged multiple symbolic interpretations. Some saw the Sphinx as a talisman to protect the city of Cairo, others associated it with astrological beliefs, while Western travelers, more removed from these traditions, saw it rather as a fabulous monument whose history remained to be elucidated. Overall, these visitors lacked a rigorous method to study the statue. The initial attempts at measurement were limited to estimating the height of the head or the width of the shoulders, sometimes using simple ropes, without considering the site's stratigraphy or the exact geological nature of the limestone composing the edifice. For example, it is reported that a Venetian diplomat of the 16th century, on a mission to the Ottoman authorities in Cairo, attempted to draw up a rough scale of the Sphinx's silhouette using poles. His testimony, transcribed in an Italian chronicle of the time, described the monument with a mix of relativity and almost fanciful imagery. On his part, an English merchant passing along the caravan route connecting Egypt to the Levant claimed to have consulted local peasants who spoke of a statue capable of causing sandstorms if certain magic words were uttered nearby. These anecdotes, often colored by superstition or the exoticism sought in travelogues, then fed into the European collective imagination without being based on established scientific findings. The hypotheses concerning the origin and function of the Sphinx seemed, however, inexhaustible. Some saw it as a representation of the idol of a pagan cult. Others accused a supposed legendary sovereign of having erected this demonic figure to dominate his subjects. Most of these conjectures relied on local gossip, misunderstood ancient writings, or simple imaginations. Thus, we find in some late Ottoman manuscripts the assertion that the Sphinx dates back to a mythical age preceding the arrival of the first pharaohs, almost making it a creation of ancient jinns, those spirits sometimes mentioned in Islamic culture. On the European side, they indulged in irrational comparisons. The idea circulated that the face of the Sphinx, even worn by time, resembled that of a biblical or heroic character, sparking all kinds of scholarly debates in aristocratic salons. Far-fetched etymologies were also proposed. Some claimed that sphinx derived from Greek words meaning strangler or knot, while others saw it as an alteration of a Coptic or Hebrew term. In reality, without solid linguistic bases, these hypotheses were based only on individual suppositions, and the absence of an archaeological method allowed this profusion of interpretations to flourish. The transmission of knowledge remained unpredictable, as accounts were scattered from city to city, sometimes published in travel diaries or logs, and at times forgotten in private archives. The rare drawings that made their way to Europe were often mere line sketches, lacking precision. It was hardly possible to discern the detailed outline of the paws or the exact shape of the body, frequently partially covered by sand or eroded. Yet, despite these gaps, there emerged little by little a desire to more faithfully record what the eye observed. In the course of the 17th century, a few French diplomats posted to the Ottoman court traveled to Egypt and during a detour observed the great statue. Their reports mention the difficulty of approaching the Sphinx, as the sand could obscure access to its flanks, and sometimes describe an unstable footing on the surrounding rocks, making measurements delicate. The result was highly literary, even poetic, descriptions that lacked a genuine willingness to dig into the soil or examine the sedimentary layers of the enclosure. Towards the first half of the 18th century, a gradual evolution was felt thanks to the publication of more meticulous accounts, enriched by a better understanding of the Ottoman world and a curious look at Egypt. It is during this period that one can note the work, or more precisely, the observations of certain travelers who attempted to make their drawings more precise. They did not have the tools of modern Egyptology or the techniques of stratigraphic archaeology, but were already striving to raise more coherent hypotheses. Nonetheless, critical thinking remained limited, and extravagant beliefs continued to circulate. Some sketches showed a sphinx adorned with an exaggeratedly prominent nemes, while other sketches suggested the presence of hidden corridors in the statue, an idea widely spread by local oral traditions that spoke of secret passages linking the Sphinx to the nearby Great Pyramids. The decisive role then fell to individuals like the Danish explorer Frederick Louis Norden, who traveled to Egypt in the 1730s and later published drawings and descriptions in works that came out in 1737 and 1755. His representations attest to a more detailed observation, though still far from any rigorous scientific method. Above all, his illustrated plates reveal a striking detail. The Sphinx already appears without a nose, confirming that it had been mutilated long before Norden's journey. Many specialists, later on, would rely on these images to refute the persistent myth that Napoleon's soldiers had fired cannon shots at the statue during the 1798 Egyptian campaign. The proof lies precisely in these drawings, made several decades before Napoleon's arrival, which clearly show the absence of the nose. Thus, Norden's iconographic testimony proves invaluable, as it documents the exact state of the Sphinx half a century before the French expedition, attesting that the facial damage was indeed much older. This lack of methodological coherence, combined with the burgeoning enthusiasm for ancient civilizations, nevertheless laid the groundwork for a more structured curiosity. Certainly, the travelers of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries had not yet developed a true archaeological discipline. However, over the decades, there is an increasing desire to verify, collect, and compare information. Some European diplomats were beginning to record their discoveries in reports that they sent not only to their kings, but also to emerging academies or learned societies, like the Royal Society in London or the Académie des Sciences in Paris. Although these institutions did not yet have Egyptological sections, their interest in astronomy, geography, and linguistics drove them to gather data about this distant land, considered a cradle of ancient knowledge. Gradually, accounts of the Sphinx statue appeared in more ambitious compilations, sometimes in the form of collections of engravings, where the authors attempted to compare drawings from different eras. Several collections of maps or illustrations, intended to illuminate the geography of the Mediterranean, included representations of this Egyptian curiosity as a nexus. Errors and distortions persisted, due to the lack of standardized methods for measuring and transcribing the reliefs. As a result, one could see engravings of the Sphinx where the body took on excessive proportions or where the animal was depicted with a head disproportionate to the bust. However, far from discouraging future explorers, this accumulation of contradictory images fostered a form of emulation, with each person wanting to correct previous cliches and achieve greater accuracy. The gradual rise of engraving and printing in Europe also promoted a wider distribution of these representations, allowing a cultured audience to have a first visual contact with the Sphinx. By the late 18th century, this desire to better understand the world, encouraged by the Enlightenment and the development of natural sciences, led to a new perspective on Egypt. Enlightened minds, like that of the writer and philosopher Volney, traveled to the country and published their experiences. Comments on the Sphinx were no longer limited to wonder or simple curiosity. People began to question the exact function of this enigmatic edifice and what techniques the ancients used to carve it. The first more precise measurements of the Sphinx's profile, albeit restricted to rudimentary instruments, indicated a vast operation of rock excavation, complemented by the addition of blocks. Volney himself, in his writings, expressed a certain perplexity at the enormity of the task accomplished by ancient builders, and hailed a work whose proportions surpassed the understanding of ordinary mortals, a sign of an emerging intellectual respect for Egyptian architecture. Yet no methodical excavation followed immediately, as political conditions remained unfavorable for the establishment of large-scale exploration projects. Nonetheless, the idea that the Sphinx needed to be studied in a more methodical and scientific way was gaining ground. Parisian, Berlin, or London circles, informed by travelers' accounts, began to speculate on the possibility of one day undertaking a scientific expedition. However, the shadow of the Ottoman Empire loomed over the region, and it was not easy for European powers to freely explore a site with such symbolic value. Diplomatic archive documents show that, as early as the late 1770s, requests for permits to visit or observe multiplied, sometimes sparingly granted by local authorities. Each permission triggered a new surge of curiosity, and sometimes a wave of publications in the European gazettes, reporting on the walk in the sand, the encounter with Bedouins, and the sight of that stone head emerging from a desert ocean. Meanwhile, the slow but real accumulation of increasingly detailed drawings, more attentive descriptions, and some ever-improvable measurements heralded the imminent arrival of a more structured mission. Western scholars, often eager to compare reality with the classical texts of Strabo or Pliny, sensed that Egypt held the keys to a much older history than imagined. The Sphinx, with its majestic appearance and mystery, presented itself as the first riddle to solve, a challenge posed to European erudition that now wanted to be rational and geared towards critical examination. While it was not yet precisely known who commissioned its carving or the exact date, at least it was certain that it deserved thorough study, as it aroused passions, superstitions, and intellectual theories. Thus, when the idea of a grand expedition to Egypt began to germinate in the minds of French strategists, particularly within the geopolitical context where France sought to destabilize England in the Orient, the prospect of bringing together engineers, illustrators, and scholars became all the more appealing. There was already the hope of accomplishing a vast mission that would catalog monuments and inscriptions, elevate the scientific prestige of the expedition, and incidentally, provide posterity with an unprecedented wealth of information about the Giza Plateau and its famous leonine statue. In 1798, the military campaign launched by Napoleon Bonaparte against Egypt opened a crucial period in the rediscovery of Egyptian antiquities, which were largely unknown to the European public until then. In the wake of the French army, a contingent of about 160 scholars, engineers, and artists, grouped within the Commission of Sciences and Arts, landed in the Nile Valley. Their official mission was to study the natural resources, history, and culture of this millennium-old land, with the objective of creating a vast inventory of its specificities. Among these researchers, some took a particular interest in the pharaonic monuments and, primarily, the wonders rising on the Giza Plateau, where the partially sand-covered silhouette of the Great Sphinx immediately caught their attention. This colossus, already mentioned in earlier accounts, was largely covered with sand at the time, especially along its sides and at the body level. However, the head and part of the bust remained visible, offering observers a fascinating spectacle that aroused both curiosity and questions. The commission members then undertook a methodical documentation effort, combining sketches, topographic surveys, and precise descriptions. Their efforts aimed to capture the site's situation before any major modifications, in hopes of understanding the historical significance of the monument. The surveys were conducted using rudimentary instruments, but were sufficient to determine approximate dimensions and produce detailed sketches. Thanks to these initial efforts, numerous plates were drawn, integrated into what would later become the monumental Description of Egypt, published in the early 19th century. This exceptional editorial work, derived from the observations accumulated by the scholars during the campaign, marked the birth of what could be considered early Egyptology. Before this period, Europeans had access to ancient accounts, often imprecise or fabulous, as well as a few scattered engravings. With the Description of Egypt, knowledge expanded considerably. The chapters written not only discussed the imposing architecture of temples, but also the funerary sites, the remains of Alexandria, the flora, the fauna, and, of course, the gigantic silhouette of the Sphinx. The plates dedicated to it, extremely detailed, allowed a broad Western audience to observe the statue from different angles for the first time, to measure the scale of the sculpture, and to grasp the complexity of its conservation state. The accompanying texts, authored by the amateur engineers and archaeologists of the Commission, suggested various hypotheses about the statue's origins and its religious significance in the Egyptian cosmology. The rapid spread of this documentation in Europe sparked a true fascination. The intellectual circles of Paris, London, and Berlin buzzed with passionate debates. To whom should the erection of the Sphinx be attributed? What was its function? What about the cartouches engraved on surrounding vestiges? And how should this gigantic example of rock art be dated? Theories multiplied, some more fanciful than others, and the question of the chronology of Egyptian civilization emerged with acuity. Some scholars suggested that the statue might be contemporary with the Great Pyramids, while others attributed it a more recent origin. The discussions were fueled by the political and scientific context of the time, as the biblical ordering of the world remained the primary framework for many thinkers. Despite these divergences, the necessity of establishing a systematic study method based on observation, comparison, and the accumulation of concrete evidence became increasingly evident. Thus, the first foundations were laid for an approach that would ultimately evolve into scientific archaeology. On the ground, during the expedition, French officers and renowned scholars also engage in a few attempts to clear the sand. They aim to study the complete morphology of the monument, particularly the configuration of the paws and the chest, which are key to any iconographic interpretation. These efforts are limited by climatic conditions and the need to secure military positions. Additionally, the available equipment remains rudimentary, consisting of shovels and baskets. Nevertheless, occasional efforts result in the partial uncovering of the Sphinx's forelimbs, enough to reveal the presence of a small temple or a cult space between the paws. This discovery, quickly recorded in the Commission's notebooks, fuels the hypothesis of a cult dedicated to this hybrid entity, possibly linked to solar or funerary rituals practiced on the plateau. Documents from the time also mention scattered blocks, likely from past repairs or ancillary structures, without it being possible to precisely determine their chronology. The impact of these initial operations is significant because it demonstrates a collective interest in preserving and understanding these extraordinary remains. High-ranking military officers like Bonaparte support scientific initiatives as long as they can serve to enhance France's prestige abroad. Later, when the expedition results in a withdrawal, all the collected material becomes an object of rivalry among imperial powers. The victorious United Kingdom seizes part of the amassed collections, while the French government strives to publish the results of the studies as quickly as possible. Beyond the war, the rise of a European craze for ancient Egypt is coupled with an imperative to conserve exotic cultural assets. Thus, we witness the conception of an administration called the antiquarian, whose role will be to oversee research, documentation, and, as far as possible, the protection of monuments. The beginnings of this administration, however, remain tentative and lack real institutionalization on site, in the region of Giza, or more generally, in Egypt. Many scholars return to Europe, taking their notes, drawings, and surveys with them, which fuels research from a distance. Local authorities, still subject to Ottoman influences, do not have a solid legal framework for the preservation of antiquities, and the very idea of systematically safeguarding these testimonies is not yet fully ingrained in the local culture, despite an ancestral respect for great pharaonic achievements. Nevertheless, the rise of heritage consciousness is gradually being felt. The political realization that heritage can be both a tourist resource and an identity symbol is being launched, although this concept is still embryonic. This pivotal moment between 1798 and 1801 thus sees the formation of the broad outlines of what will become a discipline in its own right. Field studies are refined through direct observation of monuments, and debates are structured around controversies based on concrete evidence. Having accurate plans and drawings, even if some contain inaccuracies, changes the European perspective on Nile civilizations. From now on, the public and scholars discover the Sphinx's monumentality and suspect its considerable antiquity. The craze for Egypt spreads, fueling a wave of Egyptomania in arts and fashion. Jewelry and motifs inspired by the Sphinx appear on the market, marking the emergence of a lasting fascination. This dynamic influences research durably, preparing for the advent of more in-depth investigations. Between 1817 and 1837, several adventurers and European researchers succeed each other around the Sphinx, hoping to uncover new information about ancient Egypt. The site, still largely buried under the sand at this time, already fascinates the curious. Each arrives with their own methods, often rudimentary, but always guided by the desire to unveil the secrets of the vast Giza Plateau, and, more particularly, its mysterious stone guardian. In 1817, Giovanni Battista Caviglia, a Genoese sailor turned archaeological explorer, undertook the first major excavation works. Focusing his efforts at the front of the monument, he ordered the massive removal of sand accumulated between the Sphinx's paws. As his teams of workers labored painfully in the desert heat, Caviglia eventually uncovered the famous Dream Stele, a carved block erected between the Colossus's paws, recounting the promise of kingship made to Prince Thutmose IV in antiquity. During the clearing, he also found stone fragments attributed to both the Sphinx's beard and the nemes, the emblematic headdress worn by pharaohs and reproduced on the statue. In his enthusiasm, Caviglia sent some of these fragments to various European institutions, including the British Museum in London, where several pieces still reside today. His discoveries did not go unnoticed. The press of the time reported on his findings, reinforcing the idea that true treasures lay beneath Egypt's sands. In the following years, John Shea Perring, a British engineer, distinguished himself with a series of topographical surveys on the plateau. His goal was to precisely measure the various monuments and corridors around the pyramids, a task that led him to drill some exploratory tunnels in the surrounding structures. In the wake of Perring, the British officer and adventurer Howard Vyse, active around 1835 to 1837, continued these large-scale researches. Armed with greater financial resources, he organized more intensive excavation campaigns, seeking to understand the internal structure of the plateau and the arrangement of the monuments. His approach, though often criticized for its invasive nature, nevertheless contributed to the documentation of Giza by accumulating plans, sketch maps, and technical reports on the condition of the monuments. The actions carried out by Perring, Vyse, and their teams also led to some rudimentary attempts at consolidation. The explorers quickly noticed the instability of certain cleared areas and sought empirically to prevent collapses. The inner walls of the enclosure around the Sphinx were thus the subject of the first formal surveys, which proved useful for studying the stratigraphy and better understanding the geological nature of the local limestone. Through their observations, the scholarly world then obtained the very first reliable topographical profiles of this area of Giza. The methods remained imperfect and left few structured written traces, but they constituted the beginning of a systematic study of the plateau's configuration. The advances of Caviglia, Perring, and Vyse echoed significantly in the European press. Throughout the 19th century, articles described with fascination the efforts made to free the Sphinx from the sand, regularly illustrating the monument with almost dreamlike engravings and sketches. Travelers, diplomats, and merchants also fueled this phenomenon by bringing back home sometimes romanticized tales and objects presented in salons, private museums, or curiosity cabinets. The Sphinx, already famous for its emblematic dimension, thus acquired an even more mythical status in the eyes of a public eager for exotic discoveries. At this stage, it was no longer considered just a frozen relic, but rather a living trace of a grandiose past that began to be explored more methodically. By the mid-19th century, Egypt, still governed by local dynasties under Ottoman control, began attracting the attention of European scholars and travelers fascinated by its ancient heritage. It is in this context that the figure of Auguste Mariette emerged, a French scholar born in 1821 who developed a passion early on for the country's ancient civilizations. He arrived in Egypt as a member of a mission to collect Coptic and Arabic manuscripts, but his interest quickly shifted towards pharaonic remains. While exploring the terrain, he discovered the necropolis of Saqqara, where he unearthed more than 30 catacombs housing the mummies of sacred animals. This discovery led him to conceive a project aimed at safeguarding and inventorying the countless monuments contained in the Nile Valley, then weakened by chaotic excavations and looting. At the time, discovered objects were often illegally exported or sold to private collectors, risking permanent disappearance from Egypt's heritage. Noting the urgency of the situation, Marriott relied on diplomatic support and eventually convinced the authorities of the need for an official organization tasked with preserving antiquities. In 1858, his efforts led to the creation of the Antiquities Service, which would be placed under the control of the Egyptian government. Marriott took the helm and set up offices initially located in Bulaq, a district of Cairo, where he also founded a museum designed to house the objects collected during official excavations. This museum, called the Bulaq Museum, became the first permanent exhibition space dedicated to ancient Egypt. Marriott insisted on the need for controlled excavation policies. No longer was it acceptable to let adventurers dig randomly or wait for them to discover and disperse treasures. Under his supervision, each archaeological site had to be approved by the Antiquities Service, and the objects found were to remain in Egypt to support scientific research and preserve the integrity of the heritage. His rigorous management helped stop some of the plundering, even though some foreign collectors still tried to circumvent the rules. Supported by patrons and local authorities aware of the cultural and diplomatic importance of the pharaonic heritage, Marriott gradually imposed a more systematic working method, where the recording of finds and photographic documentation began to become widespread. He aimed to provide the study of Egyptian history with a solid foundation, free from approximations and romantic speculations. This policy quickly gained momentum and established Marriott as an essential figure in the emerging field of Egyptology. Alongside the creation of museum infrastructures, the Antiquities Service developed a network of inspectors and guards responsible for monitoring major sites, including Giza, Saqqara, Luxor, and Karnak. Marriott organized more methodical excavations there than before, ensuring that each discovered object was cataloged, studied, and then preserved. His efforts had a notable impact on how the Great Pyramid, the Sphinx, and their associated complexes were approached, even though, at that time, the question of the Sphinx was not yet the main focus of research. Archaeologists primarily concentrated on hieroglyphic texts, royal tombs, and funerary temples. The rare interventions on the Sphinx mainly involved partially clearing the enclosure, removing sand, and documenting the peripheral blocks. However, the growing importance of the field of Egyptology would soon lead other researchers, like Gaston Maspero, to continue the work initiated by Marriott and to delve deeper into the study of this monumental sculpture. Gaston Maspero, born in 1846 in Paris, discovered the basics of the hieroglyphic language at a very young age. Invited by Mariette to come study on site, he traveled to Egypt and distinguished himself with a deep understanding of the texts. By the end of the 1870s, Maspero undertook additional clearing campaigns on key sites to better understand the general topography of the funerary complexes. He was more interested in dynastic history and inscriptions that could shed light on the exact function of the Sphinx during the Old Kingdom. By reading steles and fragments of papyrus, he attempted to prove that the Sphinx had always been the subject of a solar cult, referring to the god Hor-em-Akhet, or Re-Horakti. His investigations led him to spend more time than before studying the valley temples and the causeways connecting these sanctuaries to the pyramids. In this context, he conducted meticulous epigraphic surveys and compared various inscriptions, aiming to establish a more solid chronology. Maspero also engaged in a re-evaluation of discoveries attributed to Mariette, verifying inventories and seeking to refine hypotheses formulated about the Fourth Dynasty. Convinced of the Sphinx's significance in the royal theology of Khafre, he facilitated new clearance operations aimed at uncovering the surrounding courtyard and analyzing the statue's conditions of erection. However, the magnitude of the tasks remained considerable, especially since other major sites also demanded his attention. While Maspero thus lays the foundations for more systematic observation, another pioneer, Flinders Petrie, gives Egyptology a truly scientific turn. Born in 1853 in England, William Matthew Flinders Petrie initially trained in topography and metrology, two fields useful for measuring the precision of ancient constructions. Arriving in Egypt in the 1880s, he applied innovative methods, notably the use of extremely precise surveys, detailed plans, and the introduction of a rudimentary form of photogrammetry. Petrie was interested in the slightest variations in level in the monuments and multiplied stratigraphic analyses on the layers of sand, rubble, and remains surrounding the Giza Plateau. He did not hesitate to examine details such as the astronomical orientation of the pyramids or the geological composition of the blocks used for construction. According to him, rigorous observation of the field allows for deducing the relative chronology of each structure and better understanding the techniques of the Old Kingdom. In the context of the Sphinx, Petrie noted the differences in erosion between the head, sculpted in harder limestone, and the body, carved in softer layers. He called for protecting the monument from uncontrolled human actions and limiting hasty reconstructions. His work inspired many later researchers because he contributed to the standardization of archaeological recording, photographs, scaled drawings, artifact labeling, precise location of each discovery. This methodology contrasted with the more empirical style of his predecessors and heralded the emergence of a more scientific archaeology. As these pioneers refined their methods, a debate emerged within the scholarly community regarding the precise attribution of the Sphinx. Readings of the inscriptions and discoveries of fragmentary statues in the Valley Temple suggested that Khafre might be behind the sculpture, as several royal effigies found nearby bore similar stylistic traits. Furthermore, the causeway linking Khafre's pyramid to the Valley Temple passes close to the Sphinx's enclosure, suggesting architectural coherence. However, some archaeologists propose the idea that the monument might predate the 4th dynasty and was remodeled by Khafre. At that time, dating techniques did not yet allow for a definitive resolution of the question, so various hypotheses circulated in professional circles and the Western press. The surveys by Petrie and Maspero proved essential. They indicated that the general configuration of the site and the nature of the associated temples corresponded more closely to the time of Khafre than to older palaces. However, no explicit text stated Khafre had the Sphinx carved. Researchers therefore used contextual clues, whether it was the presence of processional paths, stone foundations, statuary elements, or offerings. Gradually, a consensus formed, recognizing that Khafre was very likely the patron of the work, although questions remained about possible restoration works before or after his reign. Emile Barrès, an engineer and architect mandated by the Egyptian Antiquities Service, undertook a vast program starting in 1925 to clear the Sphinx and its enclosure, which were largely sand enshrouded at the time. By then, previous interventions carried out during the 19th century and the very beginning of the 20th had already partially exposed the colossal statue, but never continuously nor sufficiently precisely to reveal it in its entirety. Barrés's excavations were part of a more structured state initiative to show the world the grandeur of this emblematic monument of the Old Kingdom while protecting it from further degradation. The resources mobilized, relatively significant for the time, marked a decisive step in the preservation of the site and the archaeological understanding of its actual state. When Barrés's team arrives on site, they find the enclosure filled with meters of accumulated sand. The constant desert winds, combined with the area's topography, funnel particles along the limestone walls. The desanding efforts require significant labor, with workers clearing tons of sediment day by day. The work is mainly done with shovels and picks, as was common at the time. Rudimentary carts, sometimes pulled by donkeys, are used to remove the sand from the enclosure. In certain areas, temporary ramps have to be imagined to facilitate transport and ensure a gradual progression of workers to the lower levels. Everything is done under the watchful eye of inspectors from the Antiquities Service, keen to avoid further deterioration of the rock surface, already worn by erosion and time. As the sand is removed, a more precise assessment allows for the drawing of topographical and architectural surveys. Barrés's team diligently maps every corner of the pit to understand the arrangement of limestone beds and the extent of previous clearings. Photographic surveys are conducted systematically. Several photographers on site use glass plates to capture each stage of the project. The position of fixed cameras, installed at high points, complements the whole, providing a panoramic view of the progress. These photographs quickly become an essential resource, not only for reporting progress to official institutions, but also for precisely documenting the monument's morphology, the quality of the rock walls, and the most damaged areas. Discoveries soon begin to emerge. As they dig down to the rocky base on which the Sphinx rests, Barrés and his team uncover traces of previous digging work, sometimes ancient, sometimes more recent. The walls of the enclosure show different levels of cutting and recutting, indicating the extraction of blocks at various times. Some blocks originally removed to model the Sphinx's body appear to have been reused in nearby structures, such as the temple associated with Khafre's causeway, discovered further upstream of the excavations. The complete rediscovery of the enclosure helps understand how the pit was shaped, a vast space dug below the plateau with a natural system of geological steps. Observing these strata, the archaeologists note the presence of soft limestones very sensitive to erosion, requiring special attention during any consolidation operation. In this regard, one of the essential aspects of the program led by Berets is to stabilize the areas deemed most fragile. The body of the Sphinx in particular shows significant cracks caused by the superposition of soft banks and harder ones. The microclimatic variations of the plateau, salinity, and the regular action of wind and sand exacerbate the deterioration of these vulnerable parts. To address this, the teams implement a repointing system, filling or reconstructing the joints between the blocks or in the rock's cracks to limit water infiltration and block sand. At the same time, stone veneers applied to the monument's flanks reinforce the most damaged areas. This choice, relatively innovative for restorations of the time, still leaves visible scars today. By carefully examining the belly and paws, one can perceive blocks of different shades, sometimes lighter, sometimes darker, revealing these modern interventions aimed at extending the original structure's lifespan. The construction site is also focused on the issue of drainage and sand trapping. If the team manages to clear the pit, it is important to design, as much as possible, measures to delay resanding. Devices are tested at strategic locations. Some involve the creation of light walls or earth dikes at the top of the enclosure, intended to divert sand flows carried by the wind. In the most exposed areas, rudimentary arrangements channel the rainwater, rare but sometimes violent, so that it does not stagnate at the foot of the statue. However, technical means remain limited. Despite the enthusiasm driving the teams, powerful machines and advanced geomorphological modeling technologies are not yet available. The solutions considered must deal with the relative lack of equipment and the urgency to protect the site from immediate threats. Within this collective dynamic, documentation takes a prominent place. Engineers and archaeologists record their observations in detailed notebooks, noting the nature of the sand layers, the precise state of the rock at each stage, the measured dimensions, and the position of each added sealant. A lot of importance is attached to photogrammetry, even though it remains in its infancy. Some shots are taken at regular intervals to allow for a three-dimensional reconstruction, based on visual calculations and perspective corrections. Each photo, numbered and associated with a date, feeds into a documentary fund that is to become the reference for all future studies on the evolution of the Sphinx's condition. The field notebooks, often handwritten, describe each incident: a partial collapse here, the need to reinforce a block there, the geological peculiarities encountered during a clearance. These archives, still consulted today, provide researchers with an invaluable framework for distinguishing what pertains to the original state of the statue, natural erosion, or modern interventions. The period 1925 to 1936 thus sees a permanent ballet of workers, foremen, draftsmen, photographers, and engineers working in close coordination. The organization operates through successive clearing zones. Workers leave a sector only when archaeologists consider it sufficiently free of sand and properly documented. In some cases, an unforeseen event occurs. A retaining wall threatens to collapse, or a limestone block detaches from the wall. Berez's teams must then improvise wooden formworks, support the rock, reinforce the cliff, or coat the base with a protective coating. These emergency measures prevent more significant damage. According to the archives, several landslides that could seriously alter the shape of the neck or partially demolish the colossus's front paws are narrowly avoided. Observers of the time sometimes recount spectacular scenes where workers rush with planks, ropes, and beams to counter a subsidence that risks occurring at night. The neck of the Sphinx, precisely, receives special attention. Exposed to the prevailing winds and erosion, it shows more pronounced cracks. Sometimes, injections of a local mortar, a mixture of lime and more or less calibrated sand, are made to seal small gaps. The blocks added for reinforcement are carefully cut to best follow the curve of the silhouette. However, there is no attempt to completely hide the difference between the ancient rock and the additions. The priority is stability. As workers release the base, special care is given to the junction between the body of the Sphinx and the bottom of the pit. Mission notebooks note that the line of contact between the native rock and the artificial layers is not always regular and sometimes requires the addition of shims. This meticulous work involves a skilled workforce trained on site to handle the stone without fracturing the already weakened limestone. Interventions around the monumental front paws also reveal the condition of the dream stela of Thutmose IV, unearthed a century earlier and still in place between the paws. The excavators examine the stela to assess the solidity of its support and check its anchorage in the ground. Some adjacent blocks are repositioned to provide a more stable anchoring. Notes from berets indicate a fear of the upper chest elements falling, which would permanently damage the royal stela. As a result, the construction sites employ reinforcement techniques that adapt to the presence of this major New Kingdom relic. A wooden scaffold sometimes encircles the stela, supporting it while the surrounding blocks are realigned or resealed. The use of Aswan stone for some monumental facings was considered, but the transport and cost proved too high for a large-scale operation. Therefore, a limestone with characteristics similar to that of the Giza Plateau, sourced from more accessible Egyptian quarries, is preferred. In each case, they try to account for porosity and approximate hue to achieve a coherent ensemble. The blocks are hand-carved and adjusted to the maximum. However, a keen eye can distinctly identify these additions. At the time, the concept of archaeological authenticity didn't carry the same weight as in contemporary museology, and the primary priority remained to preserve the Sphinx from a more severe dismemberment risk. The interlocking of the blocks, carried out one by one, occurs over several weeks, sometimes months, in the most damaged areas. The joints are then covered with a fine mortar that serves to even out the surface appearance and restrict water infiltration. During this state program, media outreach to the international public remains limited, but specialized circles are regularly informed of the progress. Technical reports are sent to major institutions in Cairo and to some European Egyptology centers. Articles are published in scientific bulletins describing the stratigraphic discoveries, the day-to-day photographs, and the expertise implemented to counteract the degradation of the monument. Reactions vary. Some praise the scale of the project, while others highlight an approach still too marked by urgent construction imperatives, perhaps at the expense of the finesse of archaeological research. Nevertheless, this extensive work of documentation and consolidation generates growing interest among new researchers who, in the following decades, will use Beres's photographs and reports to refine their hypotheses on the history of the Sphinx. Among the anecdotes noted in the construction diaries, some mention the challenge of continuously managing the presence of foreign visitors. Already, diplomats, military personnel, or simple travelers wish to gaze at the Colossus, and sometimes leave with souvenirs like small stone fragments. The supervisors ensure to control access and establish guard shifts to prevent deliberate damage. Other anecdotes mention sudden sandstorms that interrupt the work. The wind then raises a dense curtain of dust, forcing the suspension of the project for several hours, sometimes even days. The workers retreat to barracks set up near the enclosure, waiting for visibility to improve. Once the storm has passed, it's often necessary to restart some partially filled-in clearings. In their internal correspondences, Berets and his collaborators report small landslides along the southern wall. Thanks to wooden struts, they managed to prevent a major landslide that could damage the statue's flank. There are also delicate episodes at the corridor formed by the front legs. The vibrations caused by moving loads of earth threaten to widen some cracks. The engineers then devise a different itinerary to transport materials out of the enclosure, thus reducing the passage in the immediate vicinity of the statue. The precaution proves to be a lifesaver. No serious collapse occurs, and the complete clearing progresses steadily.